Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
When my dad raised his glass at my sister's wedding and let those words spill out, at least one of my daughters turned out well. You could hear the laughter ripple through the tables like it was some innocent dad joke, a casual jab to warm the room. But it wasn't a joke, and he knew it. It was aimed like a dart straight at me, with that familiar edge he'd perfected over the years. Sharp, dismissive, and somehow still coated in charm that made everyone else smile, like it was harmless. I smiled too, because I've learned that's what you do when the knife slides in. Smile, lift your glass, and take a sip like it didn't just slice through the last piece of peace you'd made with yourself. The night was picture perfect by every standard. White lights strung between oak beams, a six-piece jazz band humming through a Sinatra cover, and one of those weddings where even the napkins are embroidered with the couple's initials, where everything looks effortless because someone, me, broke her back to make it that way. Hannah glowed. I'll give her that. My baby sister always knew how to play the part. She looked like a walking Pinterest board in that lacy off-shoulder dress, her makeup just enough to look natural but flawless. Her laugh timed like a Disney princess. And Dad? He was right there beside her, soaking up the spotlight, acting like he'd raised royalty. I stood to the side for most of the night, not out of bitterness, not exactly, more out of habit. When you grow up being the difficult one, the one with the strong opinions, the one who asks too many questions, the one who doesn't fold neatly into the family photo, you learn to stay in the wings. It's quieter there. No one expects you to perform. You can just watch, take in the hypocrisy, and let it stew into something that keeps you warm when the family cold shoulders come around. Growing up, I was always the headstrong daughter. That was Dad's favorite word for me, headstrong, like it was a flaw, not a trait. I wasn't soft like Hannah. I didn't cry when he yelled. I asked why when he told me something was just the way it was. I wanted answers. That made me difficult. Hannah, on the other hand, was easy, sweet, gentle, agreeable to a fault. She knew how to work the room, even when she was 5. I remember once, I got grounded for talking back when I asked why Hannah didn't have to clean up her mess in the kitchen. His response? Because she didn't argue about it. That logic stuck with me for years. Do it quietly or don't bother doing it at all. The message was clear. Obedience mattered more than fairness. Fast forward 25 years, and there I was, standing at her wedding reception, watching Dad beam like he'd just personally handcrafted her entire future with bare hands and moral wisdom. He hadn't lifted a damn finger to pay for it. Didn't even pretend to offer more than $1,000 when it was all being planned. But there he stood, basking in praise like the world's greatest girl dad. You know what's funny? The night he made that toast, he was standing in the venue I paid for. He was drinking champagne I ordered, dining on filet mignon and scalloped potatoes that came out of my savings account, cutting a cake that cost more than his last 3 car payments combined. And he had no idea. Not a damn clue. But I kept smiling because I'm not the same Natalie he used to scold into silence. I've grown quieter, yes, but not because I've accepted his version of me. No, I've grown quiet because I learned there's more power in letting someone walk right into their own mess than in shouting a warning. And that night, as I listened to him praise my sister for making all the right choices, I knew exactly what was coming next. It wasn't just about the money. If it were, I would have written a check and moved on. No, this was about the years I spent sacrificing, the job I turned down out of college to stay close and help when Mom had her back surgery, the rent I paid for Hannah's first apartment when she was trying to find herself, the thousands I sent when she totaled her car and didn't want Dad to find out because she was scared he'd be disappointed. All of it swept under the rug. And now I was the invisible guest at a wedding I bankrolled, watching my father toast the daughter he still believed was his only real legacy. You ever wonder how many people sit through weddings clapping politely, biting their tongues, holding in stories that would flip the whole damn room upside down? Weddings aren't about truth, they're about performance. And I was about to give the final act more meaning than anyone expected. Because that same night, while Dad was clinking glasses and shaking hands, I was scheduling an email with receipts, an email that would land in his inbox just after sunrise, with every dollar accounted for and a simple subject line. For the daughter who turned out well. He didn't know it yet, but the whole illusion was about to crack. And tell me something, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet and smiled? Or would you have reminded him just who the hell really made this night possible? Because the next day, when he opened that email, the smile disappeared. There's something uniquely painful about being needed only when it's convenient, about being remembered not for who you are, but for what you've done, and even then, only when it suits the narrative of someone else's comfort. That was the unspoken contract I had with my family, especially with my sister Hannah. She would fall apart with the grace of a porcelain doll, crying softly and dramatically at all the right moments, while I, the older, more resilient one, would come in quietly to clean up the shards, write the checks, make the calls, fix what needed fixing, and then politely vanish into the background before any of the credit or gratitude could be directed my way. Over the years, I learned that in our house, usefulness wasn't rewarded. It was expected, absorbed, and then forgotten the moment the crisis was over. And nothing captured that truth more clearly than the year leading up to Hannah's wedding. It started with one of her signature breakdowns, the kind I could recognize over the phone before she even said a word. I was working late, knee-deep in contracts, when she called sobbing about how the venue she wanted was booked out unless they put down a non-refundable deposit by the end of the week. She'd found the perfect place, a rustic winery in the hills with ivy-wrapped gazebos and vintage oak barrels lining the ceremony space. And she couldn't imagine getting married anywhere else. Sam, her fiancé, was supportive but broke, and our parents, as usual, gave their favorite vague excuses about tight budgets, hinting at inflation, the stock market, and other boogeymen they liked to invoke whenever someone needed something they didn't want to pay for. Hannah, of course, turned to me. She didn't ask directly, not at first. Instead, she wrapped her request in flattery, in those honeyed tones that made everything sound like a compliment. "Nat," she said, "I just admire how stable and successful you are. You've always been the strong one. I just wish I had your sense of control, you know? You always know what to do." It was manipulation in its most elegant form, and I recognized it. But I also heard the desperation beneath it. And damn it, I'm not heartless. For all her faults, Hannah had this way of making me feel like I owed her something, like because I'd been born first, I was somehow responsible for holding the family together, like the backbone they all forgot about until it cracked. So I made the call. I told the venue manager to hold the date. I wired the deposit. And in that moment, I made a choice. Not for them, not even for Hannah, but for myself, because I knew that someday, all this silent giving would mean something. I just didn't know then how or when. Of course, the venue was just the beginning. As months passed, the list of expenses grew, the custom invitations, the overpriced flowers, the live band Hannah just had to have, the last-minute alterations to her dress, the photographer with the drone package. Every single decision was made with champagne taste and a blind eye to the budget. Sam tried in his way. He picked up side gigs and sold his motorcycle, but it wasn't even close to enough. And through it all, Dad kept his distance, nodding approvingly at Hannah's choices, but never offering more than an occasional, "Looks great, honey," like a man who thinks moral support is legal tender. It was around the third month of planning that I realized I'd spent nearly as much on this wedding as I had on my own down payment for the condo I'd bought 5 years earlier. I kept quiet because that's what I do. But something inside me started to shift. Not out of regret, but out of clarity. I began to see, with piercing sharpness, how this family operated on a current I had always been swimming against. I was expected to sacrifice because I could, to hold everyone else up because I never asked to be held myself. And worst of all, they'd convinced themselves that made them good people, because they never had to see the bruises I hid under all that strength. I made one rule when I took on the financial burden. My name wouldn't appear on a single receipt. everything would be filtered through Sam, who thought I was just helping out a bit. I told him I had reward points on a credit card I needed to burn before the expiration. He offered to pay me back someday, and I smiled. I said, "Let's just get through the wedding," and I meant it, but not in the way he thought. Mom, as always, drifted in and out of the process, her attention split between her soaps and her wine nights with friends. Every now and then, she'd call and say something like, "Isn't it nice to see Hannah so happy after all the hard years she had?" And I'd clench my jaw and nod, pretending to forget that those hard years were spent relying on me while our parents pretended their younger daughter didn't need structure, only space to grow. And then there was Dad, who treated the whole ordeal like a spectator sport. He showed up to the rehearsal dinner in golf clothes, gave a half-hearted toast about the magic of love, and told everyone how proud he was of the couple for pulling this off all on their own. I nearly choked on my drink. He honestly believed it. Or maybe he needed to believe it. Maybe that's how he kept the illusion intact, that his golden daughter didn't need rescuing and that the one he'd dismissed for years had nothing to offer but opinions and attitude. But I knew better, because while everyone else was sipping cocktails and praising Hannah's vision, I was finalizing one last document, a full financial breakdown of the wedding expenses, every invoice, every charge, every check I signed. And I was attaching it to an email set to send the morning after the big day. Not out of pettiness, but out of necessity. Sometimes, the only way to reset the narrative is to throw the truth into the center of the room and see who flinches. That night, while they toasted under string lights and posted perfect photos with glittery captions, I stepped out to the parking lot, sat in my car, and stared at the stars for a long time. And all I could think was, how many more years would I have played the role of the reliable ghost if no one had said something as stupid as, "At least one of my daughters turned out well"? The mask I wore as the good daughter had cracks now, and the woman behind it? She was done pretending to be invisible. There's a specific kind of satisfaction that comes not from yelling or throwing a scene, not from demanding an apology or forcing someone to look you in the eye and admit they were wrong, but from laying down the truth so quietly, so surgically, that by the time they realize what hit them, you're already halfway out the door, calm, unbothered, and holding all the dignity they thought you'd misplaced years ago. That was the energy I woke up with the morning after the wedding. A quiet, burning clarity that felt more like victory than anger, more like freedom than resentment, even though, in truth, it was probably a little of all those things mixed together in just the right proportions. The email went out at exactly 8 a.m., time to land just as Dad would be waking up and checking his phone while waiting for his coffee to brew. A ritual I knew well after all those years of early Saturday mornings when he'd read the newspaper and grumble about the government while I sat 2 feet away, invisible behind a cereal bowl. The subject line read, "Final Wedding Totals," and the body of the message was short, intentionally devoid of emotion, sharp as glass in a velvet glove. Attached is a full breakdown of all wedding expenses paid to date, including the venue, catering, decor, rentals, photographer, and musical entertainment. For clarity's sake, every item was paid in full by me, under Sam's name, per request, for anonymity. Thought you might want to know who really made this day happen. I didn't sign it with love. I didn't sign it at all. Attached was a 7-page document with every receipt, invoice, and bank transfer confirmation meticulously listed. Not because I needed him to acknowledge the money, I didn't, but because I needed him to see the map of my silence. The way I'd charted every detail, every sacrifice, every quiet decision I'd made to keep the spotlight on Hannah, to protect his fantasy of being the proud father of the perfect daughter. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to watch what happened when that fantasy shattered under the weight of the truth he'd spent his whole life avoiding. I didn't hear anything right away, which surprised me less than it should have. Silence was my father's favorite weapon, the one he wielded not out of ignorance, but out of control. When he didn't like something, he didn't rage or confront. He simply withdrew, like a king retreating from a battlefield he thought beneath him. But this time, I knew his silence didn't mean he didn't care. It meant he didn't know how to respond without admitting something that would cost him far more than pride. By noon, Hannah had called me 3 times and texted me twice. The messages started light. "Hey, just checking in, hope you got home okay." But by late afternoon, they were edgier, more desperate, full of guilt-flavored sweetness that barely masked the panic I could almost hear in her voice. When I finally picked up around 5, she didn't waste time on small talk. "Nat," she said, her voice lower, almost whispering, like she thought someone might be listening. "Why would you do that? Why would you send that to Dad?" I paused, letting the silence stretch until it started to hurt. Then I said, "Because he raised a daughter who turned out well. I figured he should know who paid for her big day." There was a beat of stunned silence on the line, the kind that tells you someone is trying to find the right lie and realizing they don't have one ready. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said finally, her tone shifting into something brittle and defensive. "You offered to help, remember? You said you didn't want credit." "I didn't," I said calmly, until he stood in a room I paid for and decided to use it as a stage for a punchline at my expense. Hannah sighed, and it sounded theatrical, practiced, like she was already preparing her version of the story for someone else. "You're making this about you." "It was my wedding, not some revenge plot," I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Exactly, it was your wedding, but you made me your silent wallet, and Dad made me his punchline. So now, both of you get to sit with the reality that neither of you pulled it off alone." She started to protest, but I hung up before she could finish. I wasn't interested in a performance or an apology scripted by guilt. I wanted them both to sit in the discomfort they so often reserved for me, to feel what it was like to be exposed, not in public, but in private, where it actually counts. Later that evening, a second email came through, this time from Dad. The subject line was blank. The body of the message was longer than I expected, though it read more like a legal brief than a father's reflection. Passive phrases, carefully chosen words, and a tone that suggested he still thought he was the moral high ground, even as he fumbled to reassert control over a situation he no longer owned. He wrote, "I received your message. While I appreciate your generosity to your sister, I find the decision to publicize these financials inappropriate and unnecessary. You should have come to us directly if you felt underappreciated. This isn't how families operate. This isn't how respect is earned." I stared at those last 2 sentences for a long time, feeling a slow burn creep up from my chest into my throat. That was the irony, wasn't it? He still thought I was trying to earn something from him, from them, from the broken idea of family he'd clung to all these years. He couldn't see that I'd stopped auditioning for his approval a long time ago, that the only thing I wanted now was acknowledgement of the truth, raw and unfiltered, without the sugar-coated delusion that he'd been a good father to both daughters. So I replied with 1 line and 1 image, a photo of the wedding card I'd written to Hannah, the one I never gave her, sitting next to a check I'd originally planned to include, a 5-figure gift I'd saved for over a year. In the photo, the check was ripped neatly in half. My message simply said, "You're right, respect isn't earned this way. It's earned over years. You just never noticed." I didn't expect a reply. I didn't need one, because by then, I had already rewritten the narrative, and in mine, I wasn't the failure, the disappointment, or the footnote. I was the one who paid the bill and burned the receipt. In the days that followed, the silence that had initially stretched between us like a cautious truce began to shift into something heavier, something thick with unspoken tension, and the slow unraveling of narratives that had been carefully stitched together over decades of selective memory and polite denial. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from disinterest or distraction. It was the sort that vibrates beneath your skin, that settles in your stomach like bad news not yet spoken aloud. A silence that demands attention even as it begs to be ignored. And although I knew exactly what I had done and why, part of me still waited, almost involuntarily, for someone, anyone, to break the spell, to step forward and speak the words that had been hanging in the air ever since I dropped that email like a lit match onto a house made of dry paper and generational pride. But instead of an honest conversation or an awkward phone call, What I got was a carefully orchestrated family intervention, disguised as a casual get-together at my parents' house the following Sunday, an invitation extended via a group message that included just enough smiley punctuation and vague charm to make it clear this was not optional. I knew better than to walk into that trap, so I didn't go. I stayed home, poured myself a glass of wine, and waited to see what would come crawling out of the wreckage they were trying so hard to contain. What happened instead was Hannah calling me 2 hours later, her voice tight and shaky, as if she had just walked out of a courtroom and realized she was on the wrong side of the verdict. She didn't start with an apology or even a greeting. She just dove in, her words rushed and clipped, as though rehearsed in front of a mirror and stripped of any real emotion. "They're upset, Nat," she said, as if this were news, as if she had no role in manufacturing that exact emotional grenade. "Dad's really hurt. He says you embarrassed the whole family, and Mom keeps saying this isn't what she wanted for either of us." For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the absurdity of that sentence, of the implication that I had caused some kind of irreversible harm simply by refusing to stay quiet about what had actually happened. They weren't upset that I paid for the wedding. They were upset that I'd told the truth. That's the kind of family dynamic we were dealing with. The kind where appearance wasn't just important, it was gospel. Where the truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was treason. I let her speak, not because I owed her anything, but because I wanted to hear what story she'd built around all this. And sure enough, within minutes, the narrative emerged. I was overreacting. I had taken things too personally. Dad was just trying to be funny. And couldn't I have handled things privately instead of turning it into a statement? "I didn't make a statement," I said, finally interrupting. "I sent an invoice, a list of facts. That's not drama, Hannah. That's documentation." She didn't respond to that right away. I could hear her breathing through the phone, sharp and uneven, like she was trying not to cry, but also trying to make sure I heard just enough of the emotion to feel guilty. "Do you even care how this makes me look?" she asked eventually, and the sheer narcissism of the question hit me like a slap. Not because it was surprising, but because it was so perfectly in character. In her mind, the story had always been about her, even when it wasn't. I almost said something cruel. I almost told her that the only reason she looked good in the first place was because I'd been behind the scenes making sure the cracks didn't show. But instead, I said something softer and maybe more dangerous. "I thought family helps family," I said. "At least, that's what you said when you needed money." That shut her up. She muttered something about needing time to think and hung up soon after. I didn't call her back. I didn't need to. That night, I received a second email from Dad, longer than the first, and this one was clearly meant to sound like an olive branch, though it read more like a veiled threat wrapped in fatherly concern. He talked about family values, about loyalty, about keeping private matters private. He never acknowledged the toast, never admitted that maybe, just maybe, his words had been unfair, or that his years of quiet favoritism had been noticed. Instead, he fixated on the consequences of my actions, the damage I'd done to the family's image, as if I had poured red paint on a white dress, instead of simply pointing out the stains that were already there. He ended the email with a line that stuck with me, not because it was profound, but because it was so incredibly revealing. "Next time, think about what you're really trying to prove before you make a mess like this." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He still believed this was about proving something to him, about seeking his approval, about needing his validation after all these years. He couldn't see that I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to end something. To end the quiet enabling, the backhanded compliments, the smiling dismissals, the decades of being useful but never valuable. And maybe I did make a mess. Maybe I walked into a carefully curated family story and flipped the table because I was tired of pretending the crumbs on the floor were enough to live on. But for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like the bad daughter. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped into her own story, not as a supporting character or a scapegoat, but as the author. And even if they never forgave me for it, even if they twisted it into something selfish and vindictive, I knew the truth. I didn't burn bridges. I just stopped pretending the bridge was ever built on anything but obligation and silence. Weeks passed, and though the flurry of emotion and carefully masked outrage that had erupted in the immediate aftermath of my truth-telling began to cool on the surface, there remained this low, persistent hum beneath everything, an undercurrent of discomfort that no one quite knew how to name, but that none of us could deny. Hannah went quiet in the way people do when they've been exposed, but don't know how to rebuild the facade. Her social media filled with glossy wedding photos and captions dripping in gratitude that felt like they were aimed at an audience she couldn't bear to lose. While behind the scenes, our conversations had dwindled to a silence so brittle it didn't even feel tense anymore, just hollow, like something had cracked and no one had the tools or the desire to glue it back together. My mother, for her part, returned to her usual strategy of avoidance, calling me once or twice under the guise of checking in, but always steering the conversation away from the one thing we both knew hovered between us like smoke after a fire. She asked about work, about the weather, about my dog's vet appointment, but never about the wedding, the email, or the shattered illusion of harmony we'd all worked so hard to preserve. Her silence, I realized, wasn't an accident. It was a shield, one she'd used her whole life to dodge the truth when it got too messy, too real, too painful to confront. And then, one Sunday morning, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't the casual, uncertain knock of a neighbor or a friend, nor the hurried rhythm of a delivery guy. It was measured, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar. I opened the door to find my father standing there, hands in the pockets of his worn jacket, a look on his face I couldn't quite read, somewhere between wounded pride and something that almost resembled humility, though it wasn't fully formed, more like the idea of humility trying to find a way to express itself without giving up control. He didn't ask to come in, and I didn't invite him. We stood on my porch, the morning air heavy with unspoken words, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I held the upper hand, not because I wanted power over him, but because for once, I wasn't afraid of what he might say or not say. For once, I didn't care if he approved. I read everything you sent, he began, his voice lower than usual, as if volume might trigger something he wasn't ready to handle. Every receipt, every line. I nodded, offering nothing. He continued, I don't understand why you couldn't have told us before. Why make a spectacle? Why now? And there it was, the question that revealed everything he didn't get. Even now, after everything had unfolded, he still believed this was about theatrics, about me trying to cause a scene. He still hadn't grasped that this wasn't about public embarrassment, or about him at all, really. It was about me reclaiming the space I'd been denied my entire life, the space to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be something other than the convenient, resilient afterthought. I didn't want to make a scene, I said slowly, deliberately. I wanted to show you the truth, in a language you understand, numbers, transactions, proof, because apparently, kindness without an invoice is invisible in this family. He flinched at that, not physically, but emotionally. You could see it, the way his eyes shifted, the way his jaw tensed slightly. He knew it was true, and he hated that it came from me. I know I haven't always been the best at expressing things, he said after a long pause. I come from a different generation. We didn't talk like this. We didn't say everything. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how predictably empty that excuse sounded now, like a man clinging to a map that no longer matched the terrain. It wasn't about his generation. It was about his choices, his priorities, his refusal to see me unless I was fitting into the mold he'd carved out and labeled acceptable. You didn't have to say everything, I replied, my voice steady. But you didn't have to pretend I was nothing either. Another silence fell between us, this one different. Not cold, not angry, just final. He looked down at his shoes, hands still buried in his pockets like they were holding on to the last fragments of the role he'd always played. The stern father, the wise provider, the man who never said sorry because he thought respect was something owed to him by default. And then, without a word, he nodded, barely perceptible, more a gesture to himself than to me, and turned to leave. He didn't say he was proud. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness or offer understanding. He just walked away, slow and silent, and I watched him go not with anger or triumph, but with a kind of sad clarity that settled into my bones like a long exhale after holding your breath for years. And in that moment, standing on the porch with the door still open and the air finally quiet, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until then: peace. Not because anything had been resolved or fixed or healed in the way fairy tales promise, but because I had told the truth and survived the consequences. Because I had drawn a line and dared them to step over it. Because I had stopped waiting for love that came with conditions, and finally given myself the permission to walk away from the parts of my family that only knew how to love me when I was silent. I never wanted revenge. I didn't want to ruin the wedding or humiliate anyone. I wanted to be heard. I wanted just once for someone in that family to look at me and see the woman I had become, not the difficult child, not the backup plan, not the ATM in heels, but the daughter who paid the bill, watched the speeches, and held her tongue until the moment she decided silence was no longer a virtue. I don't know what comes next. Maybe nothing. Maybe years of cold holidays and awkward small talk and more photos where I stand at the edge of the frame. Or maybe, just maybe, they'll finally see what they missed. Maybe someday they'll understand that the daughter they didn't choose to celebrate was the one who kept them all afloat when the ship was sinking. And maybe they never will, but I know. And that, after all these years, is enough.